Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to just first start off by thanking all of you for your patience. As I realize that all of you were subsequently dropped from the course, which I am not entirely understanding why exactly it is so difficult for BCCC to get the registrar to get their act together when it comes to taking attendance, because I take attendance every day and this is turned in. And yet, for some reason, they still drop all of you, which I just think a simple email to me to say, like, hey, Professor Mazur, is everybody in your class? And just saying yes would be a hell of a lot easier than making all of you go through that process of being added again, as well as me sending an email. But that's my little 10-second rant. Anyways, I hope all of you are doing well. Um, I made some changes because of the dropping from the class and being re-added and everything else. I made some changes to the critical analysis paper. It's now due on the what is today? Today is the 17th, so I made it due on the 22nd. Just let me make sure that I got that date right before you guys quote me on it. Yes, that'll be the 22nd, which is Sunday, at 11:59 p.m. So if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, you need help, guidance, feel free to text me. We can join a Zoom call or we can do a FaceTime, we can do a phone call. Okay? Great. So this first part of the lecture, I'm going to be covering the 1920s. This week we are covering the 1920s. We'll be looking at changing styles in terms of self-expression, fashion, identity, social norms, behaviors, values. We'll also be looking at issues of consumerism, commercialization, and the boom that happens in the economy basically during the post-war period. So from 1919 all the way up until 1929. Then we will be looking at the Great Depression, so the period from 1929 up until around 1936, 1937. And that's what we will be covering for this week until we get into the following week, which will be World War II. Okay, so for the first part of this lecture, I'm just going to discuss the period of the 1920s and build off some of the points that were made in the last lecture, especially as it pertains to the growth in urbanization as a consequence of migration to the cities, whether that was migration in the first migration from the south to cities in the north. It's particularly like cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, um, and also to look at the changing dynamics of the society that's moving from rural to urban. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's get started. So 1920s, several different factors that contribute to the economic expansion that's happening. Remember, at the end of World War One, Europe is completely decimated. The United States, comes out of the war, helping to be victorious, and helping Europe win the war over Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as the fact that, Europe has been decimated in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its ability to produce, not just in terms of industry, but as well as agriculture, the United States, which did not suffer any sort of debilitating damage due to the war other than human, meaning that we lost, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. We lost thousands more to what we now term PTSD, as well as, the general changes and consequences that come with war in terms of the after effects of that trauma. But infrastructurally speaking, we didn't miss a beat, right? Our factories were still open, cities are still booming. While immigration certainly did slow because of what was happening in Europe, um, we did have immigration still coming in from Asia as well as from Central and South America. So, remember that yes, the country itself did experience war, but it didn't experience it in the devastating way that would somehow slow down, if not devastate the economy. So, our economy in the 1920s is poised to produce all of the goods and services that the rest of the world needs. Our infrastructure and our technology. Recall in the last lecture, we talked about some of the inventions that were taking place, whether that is Henry Ford's conveyor belt and the system of mass production where there is a specialization along a process of an assembly line where individuals are able to do one or two tasks and finally build a final product, in this case, the Model T. But we also had improvements in terms of communication, whether it's the telegraph, eventually the telephone, improvements in terms of train travel, machines and engines and factory output. And all of that has been developing during World War I, and going into the 1920s, it only continues to expand. And because the economies in Europe have been decimated, the United States is more than capable to meet the demands of whatever Europeans need. And so with the production of all of these goods and services, this is how the economy begins to take place in terms of its growth. Second, remember, we also have natural resources, coal, oil, agricultural fields, right? We have the ability to be able to produce these areas, within these areas. We've got the resources, we've got the lumber, we've got the materials, we can produce anything that you want. We still have a huge labor force that is available, whether it is from people moving up from the South, immigrants coming from various countries, or it's people returning back from the war. We have a need for bodies to be able to produce. Finally, we also have something new that is developing because of the changes that were happening as a consequence of the reform that took place in the 1880s and 1890s in terms of the markets, especially with the banking system and federal regulation in terms of making sure that banks kept so much money on hand, that there was more protections in terms of loans and stability. There are new ways in doing banking, and one of those is what is known as credit. Okay, consumer credit. We take this for granted. You have a credit card. If you have some sort of, whether it is store card like a Home Depot, or, maybe you have a credit card with, some other company like Gap or an Old Navy or a Macy's and Nordstrom's, whatever the case may be. Or you may have a credit card with a credit card company, Citibank, Chase, MasterCard, Visa, etc. Right? Well, consumer credit really gets established during this period based off of two reasons. Is that we have an economy where more and more people are actually working. They're dependent upon employers for their money and their paychecks. But what we also see is that there's a way to get people to consume, to spend, to buy on credit. Usually what would happen is that people would be able to, they'd have to have money in hand and be able to pay for items that, in full. Well, buying on credit isn't something that's new. This was something that, had been established for generations prior to the 1920s, where people would know a store owner, they would be able to put some money down, they'd pay their bill, right, every so many months, right, a grocer, maybe a clothing store, and they'd be able to pay that money back. That is a form of credit. But here what we see is we see an expansion of that credit. This is allowing people to buy more expensive items that normally would only be afforded to people with wealth. So we're talking about this is a process of the technology that's being developed. So we have the production of radios, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, right? Items that were considered luxury, the car, for instance, that people would have to save money for, but now they could buy it on credit, put down a little bit of money and pay so often on that amount of money that has been borrowed while being charged an interest rate for the money that's being borrowed. If you guys want to, have a talk about how credit cards work and why they are a good thing in terms of establishing credit when used in an effective way or a proper way or a safe way, happy to talk to you with it and talk to you about it. But this is the reason why that credit actually lends and encourages people to spend, right? You don't need to have all the money now to enjoy the product. You can buy it now, pay later. And this is what gives the rise to this mass consumption and spending that is so characteristic of the 1920s. Whether that is buying cars, whether it's buying homes or radios or going out to eat, whatever the case may be, people are spending more. Now, with the changes in terms of the banking and the infrastructure and the money, is we also have changes in norms. One of the um, one of the areas where we see many of these changing norms, not just that we saw it in the 1880s and 1890s with women, trying to secure the right to vote and women protesting in front of the White House, women organizing, having parades, speaking in public forums, right? We also see a change in terms of women, in terms of what exactly they are doing. So one area is, of course, is fashion. Right? There is a style known as the flapper style, which is shorter skirts, looser waistlines. Women are getting rid of the corsets, right? They're wearing less restrictive clothing. We saw this in the 1890s, especially with women, being able to wear clothing that allowed them to ride bicycles or to exercise, to go swimming, right? All of these new types of styles that allow more movement. Well, the 1920s ushered in further areas of movement, right? Where women are removing themselves from the very constricted, rigid type of clothing that is associated with the Victorian era to one that is much more free flowing, right? There is, women are, able to, show off their cleavage. They have, areas where they're not having their chest boosted up because of that corset that sucks everything in, that whalebone that tightens everything up. You guys have probably seen that scene in Titanic where Rose is, where her maid is working on her and then her mother comes in and tightens it up and you can hear like literally, literally, her ribs cracking. As a result of this corset that is so constrictive, can't even breathe, right? There's a scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where, where she's putting on the corset and then she's talking to one of those military people, and she's like, "I can't breathe." Literally, that's precisely what was happening. Women were actually being suffocated because of these extremely restrictive types of clothing. Well, the 1920s are done with that, right? Women are far more liberated, right? They are able to drink in public, smoke in public, wear shorter skirts, right? Wear looser clothes, right? Be able to, physically define themselves what exactly is beautiful, right? This also goes in terms of some of the behavior, right? Smoking, dancing, openly drinking. These are these changing social mores, right? Women are able to do more, right? Not just because they have the right to vote, but because they've asserted their rights in which that's going to happen, right? Women are changing themselves. And this also happens in other two areas that are often associated with how one defines a woman, right? Marriage, for instance, right? Of course, you grow up, you go to school, you get married, you have children, right? You take care of your husband, you live a good life, right? That very traditional, narrow, limited role of women, they are abandoning that. More and more women are putting off marriage so that they can go to school, so that they can work, so that they can live their life, right? More women in the 1920s are working. It's somewhere around 9 million women in 1920 that are working. 20% of those are married women, so about 2 out of every 10, are working. They're working in telephone offices. They're working as secretaries. They're working as nurses. They're working as clerks and as typists, right? They've moved back out of the factory work that was during World War I and back into other areas. But once they got the taste for working life, for that independency, they didn't want to let go. So they looked for other opportunities, right? Does that mean that everything's equal for women? Hell no. There's still plenty of misogyny and still a lot of discrimination and still many problems that, stereotypes that are associated with women. But what we see during this period of economic expansion is we also see the changes in terms of opportunities for women. This isn't the golden era, okay, of women's rights, but it is certainly a period where women are displaying and are using and enacting and taking advantage of their new rights. That this new woman is able to assert herself in ways that her mother, her grandmother never could, right? This is that new woman. And so this is what's going to take, women into those next steps as we talk about this idea of the feminization of work, the feminization, the feminization and leadership in politics, feminism, this role that women are going to take in all areas. It really starts to show itself here in the 1920s, this more liberated woman. Okay. Now, of course, there's also, as I had mentioned in the last last lecture, is that I had mentioned the temperance movement and its link with, um, women's suffrage. Okay. Now, there were many people who were concerned that yes, if women got the right to vote, that the temperance movement might actually um, you know, might actually get enacted. And it actually does. It's what is known as the Volstead Act. It's established under the 18th Amendment, and this essentially banned the sale of liquor. Okay. Now, that did not mean that you couldn't produce your own homemade beer or make, liquor at your home on your farm and be able to produce it and consume it for yourself, right? And for others, but you could not sell it, right? You couldn't sell it en masse. But this is where the production, where this is where it starts to come in terms of this process of the Volstead Act, which is passed in 1919 and later becomes the 18th Amendment, where the production of liquor becomes illegal. Now, why exactly is this important? Well, the prohibition of liquor really leads to some serious changes in our society. Um, and one of those is going to be organized crime. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you, I'd like to show you an area here in terms of the signing in. And let me actually just sign in here so I can give you guys a sense of what's going on in terms of this aspect. There we go, sign in. And here we go. So there is there's a wonderful video, and I'll actually put it up there, that's actually titled Prohibition. Okay. And it actually talks about the Prohibition experience in the United States. And you might actually find it quite fascinating, in terms of how it affected millions of citizens and how it actually made millions of people essentially lawbreakers because of the history of alcohol consumption in the country, the role of alcohol in our celebrations, in our lifestyle, in our culture, and how this actually pushes, the movement in terms of not just the production of alcohol, but the consumption of alcohol underground, creating what we call speakeasies, right? A place where you're able to have a drink, but it's behind closed doors. It's not open. You have to have a secret code or you have to know people right to get in, all of these different aspects. Right, so let me go ahead and play this for you.
Funding for this program is provided by members of the Better Angel Society, dedicated to helping Ken Burns tell America's stories, including the Montrone family through the Panatis Foundation. The National Endowment for the Humanities, because democracy demands wisdom. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, dedicated to strengthening America's future through education. The Park Foundation, dedicated to heightening public awareness of critical issues. The corporation.
So congregations grew in size from gallons a year.
Okay.
And cynic million prescription whiskey, alleged fruit. The wealthy had one's own German chocolate cake.
Volstead Act was so much more severe. Amendment the third
and sale of what it called architect of the League's long success, architect of the League representative Andrew Volstead.
Okay, here we go.
Wayne B. Wheeler, the shrewd general counsel of the Anti-Saloon League, had written the act's first draft. Wheeler had been the chief architect of the League's long successful campaign for the 18th Amendment, and he had insisted the Volstead Act be as strict as possible. The amendment had banned the manufacture and sale of what it called intoxicating beverages. But the Volstead Act was something altogether different.
congressmen and senators who voted for the Prohibition Amendment, the 37 or 38 states that endorsed the Prohibition Amendment, did it with many of them having an understanding that beer would be allowed, Well, the Volstead Act was so much more severe and draconian than anything that had ever been prohibition in the United States up to that point.
What's an intoxicating beverage? Many people presumed that beer and light wines would be okay under the 18th Amendment. But the Volstead Act defined intoxicating as anything more than 0.5% alcohol. That would have made German chocolate cake or sauerkraut illegal, or Worcestershire sauce probably, or God knows how many other things.
But Wayne Wheeler had had to agree to some exceptions to the total ban he'd hoped for. Drinking alcohol was not itself illegal, nor was making wine at home for one's own consumption. Individuals and private clubs were also allowed to keep any alcohol they had purchased before the amendment went into effect. With an entire year to plan, the wealthy had had plenty of time to stock up before the deadline. The Yale Club in Manhattan hoarded enough bottles to slake its members' thirst for a prophetic 14 years. Congressmen from apple-growing areas made certain that hard cider would always remain available, insisting that farmers' wives needed to conserve their fruit. The makers of patent medicines that included alcohol were allowed to stay in business. So were the few distillers of hard liquor still operating, licensed by the government to make whiskey, allegedly meant only for medicinal purposes.
The prescription was the legal way of bringing whiskey into your home. So for those that could afford to go through the doctor and get your 1 pint every 10 days, that was all you were allowed, 3 pints a month. Not enough to get by on. So a lot of members of the same family got sick. So an epidemic broke out. And by the time Prohibition was done, doctors had written over 6 million prescriptions.
Manufacturers of industrial alcohol needed for everything from aftershave to antifreeze, felt hats to embalming fluid, could stay open too, provided they obtained a license from the government. Sacramental wine, used by churches and synagogues, was permitted as well, and orders for it quickly increased by millions of gallons a year. Not more than 1/4 of this is sacramental, one churchman admitted. The rest is sacrilegious.
A Jewish household was allowed a certain amount of wine per adult per year, but you had to have a certification from your rabbi. So congregations grew in size from 1920 to 1921 by a factor of 10, from 80 families to 900 families. Another manifestation of it were people who declared themselves rabbis. Of course, unlike in the Catholic Church, if you said you were a rabbi, who was going to say you weren't a rabbi? And there were rabbis with names like Kelly and O'Shanahan, and there were black rabbis. It was a real racket.
When Republican Warren G. Harding was inaugurated President of the United States in 1921, it seemed to Wheeler and the Drys that their cause would have a friend in the White House. But privately, Harding was not convinced Prohibition could ever be made to work. And while no alcohol was officially served in his White House, the twice-weekly meetings of his poker cabinet were fueled by whiskey provided by a bootlegger.
This law will be obeyed. We shall see to it that liquor is not manufactured, nor sold, nor given away, nor hauled in anything on the surface of the earth, or under the earth, or in the air. John F. Kramer, Prohibition Commission.
Federal responsibility for enforcing the Volstead Act was divided between two departments. A freshly created Prohibition Bureau within the Treasury Department was meant to arrest violators, gather evidence, and destroy it. But Congress authorized only 1,500 agents to cover the whole country, just one for every 70,666 Americans. The Justice Department was to handle the prosecution of violators. To head it, President Harding named his close friend and campaign manager, Harry Daugherty, who preferred dispensing patronage to practicing law. Doherty's Ohio gang, the circle of hard-drinking old friends he rewarded with federal jobs, quickly came to see the enforcement of prohibition as a potential profit center, selling bootleggers pardons, paroles, and protection from arrest and prosecution.
Okay. So right there is what we're talking about, right? Is this idea that prohibition, we're talking about, remember, a culture in this country where the Mayflower comes over with its entire hull filled with beer. George Washington, when he was the general during the Revolutionary War, gave his men, a cup of rum a day as part of their rations. People would have cider in their house, right? We're talking about people drinking all of the time, okay? And so now we have this law that many people thought at first, well, of course, beer is going to be allowed and wine will be allowed, but under the fine print, none of that is allowed. And so even the president, Warren G. Harding, who's like, well, we'll enforce it because that's what we're supposed to do, but it doesn't seem like this is going to work very well. Why? Because we don't necessarily have the resources to commit to making sure that this is going to be enforced, right? You're talking about, as you pointed out with the Justice Department, one agent for every 70,000 Americans at the time, right? To be able to see what's actually going on and if people are actually obeying the law. It's just not going to be feasible. And what you can see there is that already, given the fact of the cultural connection that people have with alcohol, those who are in power to be able to dispense punishment or to allow people to get away with various crimes now have the influence to be able to make some money off of this situation, right? That, hey, I know somebody who's bootlegging, I know somebody who's making illegal whiskey or illegal rye and they're, using that still that they have on their farm and producing it or running it, across state lines, right? All of these different aspects that these areas now open themselves up to more organized process of crime. Okay. And so this is where, the 1920s become a period where organized crime becomes a business, a full wholesale business, mainly because of this desire for people to want to drink, right? You heard the wealthy people, they were able to stack money away, right? Well, regular people, alcohol away, but regular people couldn't do that. So they're still going to want to get their alcohol for their celebrations, graduations, wedding anniversaries, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, right? Whatever people are celebrating, the birth of your child, the graduation of your child, I don't know, maybe your divorce you're celebrating, could be a lot of different things. But this wasn't going to get people to stop consuming, but now we have an ability in which to make some money off of it, some profit, right? Fraud, greed, and of course, organized crime. And of course, one of the individuals that is, most known for this is Al Capone, right? And when you create essentially a black market, right? When you have the ability in which to have a high demand of it, a highly illegal product, you have the ability in which to make massive amounts of money. And of course, in steps organized crime, where they're working with government officials, local authorities such as the police, as well as street gangs and, bosses and all of the like, right? This is where this comes in. And so what's fascinating about this is that Al Capone, an individual like him, as well as other mob bosses of the time, this generates enormous profits, right? Because alcohol is profitable. People want the product. And so bootlegging allows, these nationwide syndicates to develop across the country, right? This ability in which to run molasses from places like Cuba or, sugarcane coming from Mexico, right? Into the United States so that it can be processed into liquor. right? These are the the aspects in terms of this nationwide crime that once seemed to be like, oh, people are producing wine or beer at their house, who really cares, into something that's moving beyond something small to something absolutely huge. And this is where the problem comes in, is that it enables two things: violence and corruption, right? Because once you have tasted that money and those resources, you want to acquire more of it. And in order to acquire more of that money, you have to acquire more power and influence. And in order to do that, you have to be more violent, because you're not going to be able to get much with, with a smile and a pen. Having a gun is probably something that's going to get people a little bit more motivated in that sense. So, so really, take a look, and there's really some fascinating things that you can click on this in terms of the prohibition profits that, really change, the role of the mob. But there's also some things that, that are actually quite interesting in terms of the role of the mob in the 1920s and in the 1930s, in terms of some of the money that is used by the mob, especially Jewish mobsters, who actually use a lot of their money and influence to try to fight off the authoritarianism and bigoted hatred by people like the Nazis. And there's a fascinating book. It's called Gangsters and Nazis. If you ever want to pick it up, it basically tells the story of how Jewish mobsters, who often were running illegal businesses, not just bootlicking, but gambling as well, and use their money and their influence to be able to fight against, other problems that are going on abroad in Europe. And so, so take a look. Pretty fascinating stuff. So despite the consumption that people want in terms of alcohol, right? Despite the Volstead Act, despite all of these areas and this culture that arises, one of the other characteristics that I want you guys to take away from this period is consumption, right? That the selling of goods and services to people, this is where the modern advertisement, the modern production in terms of selling people something, right? Not just a good and a service, but an idea, right? The role of technology, particularly in mass media, whether we're talking about newspapers, magazines, billboards, and particularly radio, was extremely prominent during this period. And what it does is, using the new credit system of this buy now, pay later, it is able to create a culture of consumption where people can just buy something that's going to help them reach their dreams, right? For many Americans during this period of the 1920s, this is a period where they actually are finding far more leisure. Why? Well, because of the technology of the period. Whereas, even individuals whose labor, right, is highly dependent on their survival. So you take people on farms, right? These are individuals that are no longer having to work an 18-hour day. They're still working extremely long hours, 9, 10 hours a day, but they're actually finding that because of the technology, their new tractors, their new thresher machines, they're able to actually produce more and get greater yields with the new fertilizers, the new chemicals, right, on their crops, and actually find that they have leisure time. Same thing for people in the cities. They're working an 8-hour day. Right? They have more times on the weekends. So there's actually time for pleasure, right? Those things that you enjoy, whether it is going to the movies, whether it's taking a ride in that car, whether it is, going to the downtown to go, to have a meal, to go to Coney Island, right? To do whatever it is. There's more of this idea of consuming experiences, consuming, ways of performing and living a better lifestyle. And this is where this really comes in this idea of consumption and popular culture. And so let me just play, a clip for you so that you can see this.
In the 1920s, many Americans had disposable income to spend. What were they spending it on? Where were these products coming from? Throughout the early 1900s, Henry Ford developed and refined the assembly line method. Ford's automobile factories could produce vehicles more efficiently and cheaper than ever before. Using the assembly line method, workers would perform one task on each automobile and then it would move down the line to the next worker who would complete a different task. With this method, Ford could roll a car off the assembly line every 10 seconds. This type of mass production allowed the average price of an automobile to drop from $850 to $250. Ford's methods were quickly adopted by other industries. Skilled laborers were no longer needed to assemble finished products. Instead, it was only necessary to train an unskilled laborer how to do one simple task. Suddenly, factories were churning out countless numbers of products that were once deemed luxury items. Now that these products could be produced in such large quantities, they became affordable to the average person. More factory jobs meant more workers as well. Not only were more people being employed, but they were also receiving good wages. The average worker's wage rose by 20% during the 1920s. With more people working for higher wages, they no longer needed to spend all their money on essential items such as food, housing, and clothing. These workers began to emerge as what is now thought of as the middle class. This new middle class discovered that it was free to spend their disposable income on many of the new luxury items that were being produced. Many of these items were becoming available and useful because of the increased use of electricity. Things like refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and radios were all becoming staples of the average home. The new mass production methods made these products inexpensive because they could be produced quickly. For example, by the end of the 1920s, more than 1 million refrigerators were being produced each year. Also, more than 10 million radios had been sold by 1929. With the influx of new products to buy, something else emerged as well. Companies began mass marketing their products and competing with rival companies for the business of consumers. Advertisements became increasingly common throughout the decade. Radio proved to be an excellent method for advertisers to communicate with large numbers of people at the same time. Each advertisement was used to convince the listener that they absolutely needed the latest gadget or healthcare product. Advertisements proved very effective too. For example, sales of Listerine skyrocketed from $100,000 a year in 1921 to more than $4 million a year by 1927. Unfortunately, even though the new middle class had more disposable income than ever before, some products were still too expensive for many people to buy. This was especially true of automobiles and other high-priced items. Therefore, a new method of purchasing was created. It became known as buying on installment or credit. A down payment would be made on the item, and the rest of the purchase price would be paid off over the course of the next several months or even years. This led to millions of Americans facing large and unnecessary debts at the conclusion of the decade.
Okay, which is where we're going to go, in that sense, because during this week, we're also going to be talking about the other issues in terms of consumption, credit, and how those crises again appear between 2007 and 2009. But for this period of the 1920s, the key is to know that because of the changes that are happening in terms of technological development, production, as well as changes in terms of buying and selling goods, particularly buying on credit, and the ability in which to actually enjoy these items, not just because they are cheaper, but because there is more time. This is what is creating this consumption culture. It's really born here during the 1920s. Now, there's a wonderful, wonderful quote by this woman by the name of Helen Landon Cass, and she was a advertiser, one of the most well-known during the period in the 1920s. And she came up with this term, sell them their dreams, right? Sell them what they've longed for, right? what they know that they have to have, right? This idea that, you know what, give them a sense of, you know, what it is that they cannot do without, or sell them something that they've always wanted to be, or where they've always wanted to go, or what is this lifestyle that they want, right? Because she puts it right there. After all, people don't buy things to have things. They buy things to work for them. They buy hope, hope of what your merchandise will do for them. Sell them this hope, and you won't have to worry about selling them goods because that's what the product is. Products themselves is what gives you that sense, right? That sense of superiority, that sense of achievement, that sense of being a part of a certain group, right? Whatever that case may be. And so think about it. Let's think about all those items that are coveted, right? Things that give us a sense of like who we want to be through what we consume, right? So you think of the labels, you think of Ferragamo, or you think of, you know, Louis Vuitton, or you think of Nike, you think of Jordan, right? You think of David Yurman or Bulgari or what Tiffany's or whatever the case may be, right? Those different ideas, that's what associated with that label. That idea of associating a label with an experience, with a lifestyle, right? A product with an experience is what is developed in the 1920s. And we still have it today, right? If that you want to take a look at like an example of it. So this is a uh, a commercial. You probably have seen them, and they were big in the 1990s. And I'll just play this one.
New designer outfit, $250. New lipstick, $35. Bag, $90. Ex-boyfriend's face, priceless. There are some things money can't buy. For everything else, there's MasterCard.
For everything else, there's MasterCard. For some things, there's money that can't buy, right? Doesn't matter. What is she buying? Satisfaction, right? A sense of achievement. The fact that she's got her ex still wanting her, right? Money can't buy you that. But the dress, the purse, right? Everything else. And the fact that they're tying the spending to this emotional state, that is what is most crucial, right? That's what I want you guys to think about is like, where does that come from? Well, it comes from the 1920s. All right. So that's where we're going to stop for this one. Look forward to the next lecture where we get into more of the changes that happen in terms of the 1920s, and then we'll get into the issues of the Great Depression in terms of the changes in the market and ultimately the economic crisis. All right.